I get asked a lot about which plugins I use to make my development faster. ReSharper is a common guess. The truth, though, is that I use just plain Visual Studio with no paid plugins. I do this because I don't want you, as the viewer, to think you have to buy an expensive add-on to do what I do. In this video, I'm going to show you 15 tips to make your development experience faster and more consistent using just the tools built into Visual Studio. Now, if you haven't come across me before, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. One of the ways I do that is by teaching context. There are a lot of tutorials out there that teach you what to do. I go a few steps beyond that to show you when to do it, why you should or should not do it, what pitfalls to avoid, and what the best practices are. Basically, I get you ready for the real world. If that's the type of training you are interested in, subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. Also, make sure you look in the description of each video for relevant links. For instance, each video has a link to my Patreon. As a Patreon member, you'll get exclusive perks. In fact, if you're a Patreon member, you should be receiving something very soon. You'll also find a link to join the mailing list. This is the best way to get discounts on courses and other important news. Now, in this video's description, you'll also see time links to each tip in this video, so you can use this video as a reference tool for later review. All right, let's go to Visual Studio, and I'm going to use the IAmTimCorey Retail Manager solution as the project to then use to see the editor, okay? So we're not going to actually make any code changes to this project. And if you are wondering, yes, IAmTimCorey Retail Manager is coming back. We'll be doing more on this very, very soon. But I want to use this code base to show us how to work with the editor more efficiently. So this first tip is going to be about Intellicode. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen Intellicode before. I just turned it on in my Visual Studio because I didn't want to confuse people with what it was before I showed you how to use it. This is a newer feature that is now built into Visual Studio as an extension. You go to Extensions, Manage Extensions, and you go to Installed. You should see down here Visual Studio Intellicode. If it's not enabled or if it's not installed, you can go ahead and install it by going online and searching for Visual Studio Intellicode. And the description says this is AI-assisted developer productivity tool. All right, and that's exactly what it is. So what this does is it helps us be more productive in our code by having an AI assist for us that makes IntelliSense even better. Let's see what we mean by that. So let's go to, it doesn't really matter. Let's open up, let's go to login view, okay? So in here, let's come down, actually, let's go to a helper class that's a little bit more code in it. All right, so we have a box here. Let's go to one that has a string. Here we go, set bound password. So in Intellicode, let's just say I did a console write line. Well, right now it's not telling me much besides just normal IntelliSense, but once we have Intellicode kind of spool up, and a build or rebuild sometimes helps that, what will happen is it will actually give us a list with the suggestions up top. So I hit Ctrl+J again, and now notice there's 4 starred items. This is Intellicode saying, you know what? Here are the most common suggestions for you in this particular instance. So it's saying, I think probably the most common thing you're going to put in console.writeLine is value. Why value? Because it's a string. All right. But there's also D, which is dependency object. There's also get bound password and bound password property. These are both values. These are all 4 values we could put into this write line that have been generated somewhere. So it's saying, I know you've got these generated values. That might be what you want to write out to the console. And so I'm going to suggest that in order of importance, or order I think that you might want them. And so it's going to put a string first, and it puts the other ones after that. So that's pretty cool. We don't have to search through this entire list of options. When it's going to bubble up to the top, the ones that are most important to us. Let's do something a little different. Let's go up and we're going to add a using statement up here for using system.io. Okay, so system.io is how you work with files. So let's come back down here and I'm going to say, let's do path dot. Okay, now again, it takes a little bit for this to come in, but there we go. So now we have some suggestions. What are the 4 most common things that path is used for? Combine, get full path, directory separator character, and get temp file name. So these are the most common things used on that path. Now what if I were to say file instead? Does it exist? Write all text, read all text, delete, and open read. These are the most common things. Again, there's a whole list of options you could go through, and you can look through all of these and find the one you want, but these are the most common. And so if you're not real familiar with the file, the system.io.file, you can look here and go, oh, I see. These are the most common ones. Let's see if one of those is the one I want. Okay, same with directory. Okay, create directory, get current directory, exists, and get files. Those are the most common things you do with a directory. There's other things you can do, get directory, root, get file system entries, but the most common ones are these 4. Now let's talk for a minute. How did Intellicode know that these are those most commonly used options for directory? Well, what Microsoft did is they went to GitHub and looked at a number of open source projects, lots of them. I don't want to quote the number or misquote the number, but it was a lot of them. And they looked at all the code and they analyzed it. And they said, okay, here are the common patterns for writing C# code. So here's the common methods that people use. Here's the common parameters people use. And here's how C# is commonly developed. And so that's where they get these suggestions from, is that learning process. They had an artificial intelligence scan all that code, open source code, so it's not like it's secret code, open source code. It scanned it and said, here's how that code gets written. Here is the most important things people use, the most common things. Now, that's tip number 1 is Intellicode. Intellicode just out of the box makes your life easier. Okay? But you may be saying, Tim, you know what? My code base isn't like most other code bases. In fact, it's a little different. The way we do things at work or the way I do things is just different. I use different things inside of Visual Studio than most people do. I use different directory options or file options or something else. Or I have my own library with certain things I do. So it's not really going to help me to use Intellicode. Well, it will, because don't forget that console write line said you probably want value, and that was learning from my code, this code right here. But there is also another thing you can do, and that's if you go to the View menu, go to Other Windows, and go to Intellicode Model Management. Now, if you don't have this, go to Tools, Options, and down here under Intellicode, under General, make sure I enabled the output window logging C# base model, XAML base model. Isn't that kind of cool? We have XAML options too. And I also enabled, the acquired team models for completion. This is kind of an important one to enable, but then I did all my C# ones as well. Basically, I want to use all of these options here. With that, now I can go to View, Other Windows, and I can say Intellicode Model Management. And what this does is it's going to create an AI scan of my specific code. I'm going to teach it based upon my code that I've already written. This TIMCO Retail Manager project. It's going to learn based upon this, and then it's going to suggest for me things that are unique to me. So let's create a model. And if we click on TIMCO Retail Manager, we'll see that it's learning your codes patterns. And this will go through about a 30-second to 5-minute process where it scans your code and learns all about how you do things. Now, if that concerns you, don't worry. Yes, this is scanning your code, and yes, this is creating a model based upon your code, which is done now. But this is not giving this to Microsoft. This is not giving this to the rest of the world. This is based upon your login to Visual Studio. It's secured via HTTPS to your login in Visual Studio, which means you do have access to this on other machines, the same model. And you can share this model. If I click this, it's going to copy a link to the clipboard. Okay, so if we go over here, I just paste this in, it's going to create a link for you. And I won't paste it because I won't show you my specific link, but it's a link to the cloud. Now, if anyone has that link, they have a link to your specific model, which can be used to help train their Visual Studio or tell their Visual Studio how to work with your particular code base or your particular code style. Okay, but it's not giving your code away, and you control this. If you decide, you know what, I don't want this anymore, I don't want to have access to this, hit delete. You're good to go. If you want to retrain it, as in you've made some changes to your code base and you think that there's new suggestions you might want to have visible to you, hit retrain. And it'll retrain on the same code base. You can have more than one of these. So you can train this on multiple projects at your company and then bring all those suggestions together into one big suggestion list. So it's going to take the Microsoft suggestions and it's going to take your suggestions and kind of combine them. So you'll have a really targeted suggestion list for you based upon the most common things that you might need. Now, there's also a link here that says automatic model retraining. And what that's going to do is going to teach you how to use Azure DevOps to make model training part of your build process, which will allow your whole team to have the latest model, for the Intellicode model, the latest one based upon the latest build. So that's a neat feature as well. We're not going to get into that today, but that's a possibility if you want to go that far. But this right here allows your whole team to get on the same page and become faster and more efficient. Even if it's just you don't have a team. This still gives you those suggestions at the top that are most common for the way you do things. Really important, really cool stuff here. All right, so that's Intellicode. Now, one of the things that people have seen me do quite a bit, let's create, let's go over to our API and we're going to controller. Let's go to we already have this here. Let's go to, there we go. So token controller. Now in the token controller, I don't have an I configuration. Notice here I have I configuration. And token controller, I want an I configuration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want an I configuration. I'm going to control dot to add my using statement. And then I'm going to say config. And I do control dot again and say create initialize field underscore config. And a few of you said, whoa. I don't get that when I do this. I don't get the underscore. I just get config and it doesn't look right. Well, that's because I made a change to my code styles. So let's go to Tools, Options, and if we come up to the source code, not source code, text editor, there we go, C#, code styles. Inside of here, we have formatting, naming. There we go. So code styles is a bunch of stuff here. We're going to look at more of these in just a minute, but let's look first at naming. Now, because I have increased my fonts for video consumption, it kind of crunches them here. This is not ideal. But in here, you'll notice that I have private or internal field. And it says field name. Well, how did I get that? Well, I created that as an option. So you can say manage naming styles. I have field name. I created that by hitting the plus and filling this in. I'll show you what I filled it in with. I called it underscore field name. Required prefix is an underscore, and then it's camel case name after that. So the sample is underscore example identifier. Now, if I put a underscore afterwards, notice it's going to put an underscore afterwards as well. And if I said word separator is a dash, now I have kind of snake case, but still kind of camel snake case, which is weird. Okay, but this shows you what it's going to turn out like. So I have Pascal case. Notice it's going to change to a capital E. I can have first word upper. I can have all upper. Okay, some really ugly styles here. But what that allows me to do is say, okay, I want Pascal case. I don't want a suffix or a word separator. Oops, I want camel case. There we go. That's what I want an item to look like. So I created that naming style first. Then I said manage specifications. And I chose which specification to create. In this case, it's already there, private or internal field. And that's what this right here, the I configuration, that's what that is. It's a private or internal field. Okay, a field is a variable that you can access in your class. All right, so it's not a property, it's a field. If it was a property, it'd have a get and a set at the end of it. So a private or internal field gets this field name casing. Okay, and that's a suggestion. I could say, you know what? No, that's an error message. I'm going to leave that as a suggestion though. But that's how I have changed the way that it creates this variable. All right. So now when I do my quick action and refactor and I say, give me a private read only for this, it creates it in the correct format that I want. And that's based upon under text editor, C#, code styles, naming. And I made that change. Okay. So that's how I made that change. But there's tons of other options inside code style. Let's look at some other ones in general. And this is the really cool thing, I think, because it's hard to understand what qualify field access with this. I'm not quite sure what that means. Now I do, but let's pretend I didn't. Well, if I said prefer this, watch what happens down here. That's what it's going to look like. Oh, no, I don't want that. I want that. Okay, so you'll see what each thing is going to do. Now this is for field, property, method, and event. Okay, there's a ton of other options in here. var preference for built-in type. Prefer var? Sure. All right, when variable type is a parent, then prefer explicit type or prefer var. Notice I can change that and it shows me what the values are. And that's a refactoring. Elsewhere. So var or explicit type. I get to choose. Okay. And based upon my preferences, I can then apply these as refactorings, suggestions, warnings, or errors. So let's just do a couple of these. I'm going to say I want var for everything. And I don't want to be a suggestion. I want it to be an error if you don't use var. Let's say we're going to go full var at my organization at Timco. We're going full var, nothing else. And I'll hit OK in a minute. What we're going to do is see how this then affects our code. All right. Now formatting. This is kind of cool. So automatically format when typing. That's awesome. So when you don't put the spaces in the right spots, that takes care of it when you're typing. Also, when you put a curly brace. Also, when you return or when you paste. So I paste something in, it's going to format it for me automatically. Really cool. How about some other stuff in here? Indentation. How do you want to indent things? Do we want to indent code blocks? No? Yes. Okay, see the difference down here? Indent, open, and close curly braces. Oh, that's horrible. Leave it back the way it was. Okay, most of these will probably be fine. But do you want indent case, or do you want the contents, or do you want the align with case? I don't want to do that. I want to have them indented. But you know what? I don't want to do, when I have a curly brace, I want the curly brace to line up with case. That seems reasonable. Case labels, then I can bring them back underneath the curly brace and save myself a little bit of space. That makes sense, kind of. It's up to you if you want to do that or not. I'm going to leave it the way it is, but it's definitely up to you. Now, here's one. Place go-to labels. Okay, stop right there. Don't use go-to labels. How about that? Okay, so ignore that section. Don't use go-to labels. Just don't. Just don't. Don't. All right. Have I specified that enough? Don't use go-to. All right, new lines. Now, if you've ever used JavaScript, the way that we lay out C# code may seem odd. This would allow you to make your C# code look like JavaScript. Don't do that, because that's very uncommon, and it will clash with everybody else in the universe when it comes to working with their C# code versus yours. But, for example, I can open up a curly brace on the same line if I uncheck this box. Again, that's a JavaScript thing, and there's a reason for it in JavaScript. It's not just because that's the way JavaScript is, although it is a little bit. But in C#, we started on a new line. We call that cleaner. I do like that better. I like that formatting better, even though when I'm in JavaScript, I do follow this pattern. Okay? So definitely don't bring your ideas or your thoughts from other languages and try to apply them here in the formatting. Try and apply the formatting that is generally accepted as best practice. The nice thing is, by default, that Visual Studio is set up to pretty much all best practices or most commonly used practices for C#, which is excellent. But if you work at a company where they do want to have a little bit different setup, let's say control blocks. They want to start control blocks with a curly brace on the same line. You can come in here and make this change so that your editor is not fighting all the time with their editors. Because if you do a format and it changes all of them to look like this, and they do a format and changes them all to look like this, your source control is going to have a bunch of little changes all over the place every time each of you checks in code. That's not good. Not if you're just changing the formatting back and forth and having a little format war. You don't want format wars. So this is the place to make those changes and have them apply automatically. Remember back here, automatically format on paste, on return, on close curly brace, on semicolon when typing. So it's going to keep fighting with you to do what it thinks is the right thing. So make sure you set up what those right things are in here and here. Okay? Same as spacing. Do you want to mess with spacing or change how spacing works? And this is not how many spaces to use. We'll see that in a minute. This is, do you want to insert a space between a method name and its opening parentheses? So that GUI right here. There's no space. Click that. And now notice there's a space between GUI and the open parens. So again, you get to change that if you want. Wrapping, same thing. Leave blocks on a single line, or do you want to wrap them like so? I don't like that. I like the single line. And statement members and declarations on the same line. I kind of prefer that. I don't like to have multiple lines on one. Okay, so I'm going to leave it like that. Now, with all of that being applied, notice the vars are still applied. I'm going to hit OK. Okay, and now if I were to do a build solution, it should be it starts picking up on issues that I have. Oh, these are all vars. Look at that. Let's go over here where they're not vars. Look at that. Sales data, string. These are now errors. Notice a little 3 here for errors. And if I click it, it actually says 9 because multiple files have errors. That's because I said that this is an error. This is a problem to not have var. If I hover over it, use my use var instead of explicit type in the quick actions, and now it's all happy. Okay. Now, if you say, you know what? Nope, we're going to change that. Let's go back to tools, options, and once this opens, it's going to take a little bit, evidently, but we can change it back and say, you know what? That's actually a warning. That's not really a big deal. Now, it actually crashed my Visual Studio right there. So let's try that again. There we go. So now we can come back to our text editor, C#, code styles, and down here for var, I said prefer var. Well, let's just make that a refactoring. Let's make a suggestion. Okay, so I'm going to suggest I use var, but that's it. I'm not going to yell at you and give you a red squiggly. I'm just going to give you a quick suggestion. Okay, so let's close this out and we'll open this. And it should be that it gives us suggestions. Notice it kind of grays it out a little bit and have a little dots underneath sales data. And it says, hey, you want to use var instead, but it's subtle. It's just a little indication. It's barely noticeable. Notice it's a little darker than if I were to use var. It kind of lights up a little bit, takes that dot away. So again, subtle for just notification. But if you wanted to have something more pronounced, so I can turn off, let's just see just the error messages. There we go. Just the messages, there's where it's going to tell me, okay, use var here instead. Okay, so that is the code styles. Let's talk now about the editor config, because this is one that is newer and it's one you may have missed in a recent release. Now let's go back to our tools, let's go to options, and back here at coding styles, notice it says generate.editorconfig file from settings. So an editor config file is a file that has these settings in it. Let's click generate. We do that, let's put it right in the root of Timco. I'll hit OK. I'll hit OK. A new editor config file is detected at the root of solution. Would you like to make it a solution item? Yes. And now we've got here, notice solution items. Let's kind of collapse these down. Under solution items, I have editor config. And this is a config file with a whole bunch of settings. And there's some really long names in here. And they're somewhat readable. C# prefer braces, true, and it's a warning. Okay, so what's going to happen is if I have an if statement, let's just create an if statement here. If 1 equals 1, then yes, like that. That's technically valid C# code because I only have one line here after the if. Therefore, this line applies to if this is true. I'm not a big fan of that. I prefer to see it as having curly braces. Notice the green squiggly under if, and it says add braces. You click that, it's going to add those braces, and now it's all happy. Let's undo that. Let's go back to our editor config. Notice it says warning. Well, let's change this to error. Okay? And now what's going to happen is it's going to turn red and say, that's a problem. You can't do that. And so just by changing this editor config, we've changed our settings. And this editor config, since it applies at the solution level, applies to all my projects. I can also have an editor config inside a project, and it's going to apply the one closest to the issue, kind of like CSS does. Now you may ask, why do we create these files, which are a little harder to read, when we have the Tools Options dialog? And the reason we create these files is because this can go into source control. What does that mean? It means you can take these settings, create a file that works for you or your company, and then have everybody use the same settings. So what's the order that this gets applied in? Well, it applies the closest editor config to your code, and then it goes up the chain. So notice, remove the line below if you want to inherit editor config settings from a higher directory. In this case, we said root equals true because this is the root editor config. This is the authoritative one. All right, but if you're in a lower directory, you can turn that off, and then it's going to inherit settings from a higher directory. Or you can say, nope, this is the authoritative one at this level. And then if there is no setting, then the tools, options, code style from your Visual Studio will apply. But this allows you to make all these settings and change them based upon what you think is best, and then also change how it alerts you. You can say, instead of silent, which is that refactor only, we're going to change that to suggestion, or to warning, or to error. Now, the nice thing is that you can build out your options visually, see what the results are for most of them, and then generate that editor config file from there. Then you can take this editor config file and share it around, or even tweak it for something else. Now, editor config, just so you know, is not a Microsoft thing. Microsoft has adopted this standard. This is an industry standard. It applies to much more than just Visual Studio. It's not a Visual Studio native thing. It's something that Microsoft has brought into Visual Studio and said, yes, we want to do that. And so here's our application of the editor config option. So when you search online for editor config, you may find solutions or help that are not specific to Visual Studio and options that might not work in Visual Studio because they're not implemented. But this is a standard that Microsoft is applying. Now, there's another way to create an editor config file. I think this is pretty cool. And so sometimes I'm kind of torn with which way I want to do this. You can right-click on a project or a solution, and you can say Add New Editor Config. And this is Intellicode. So this is part of Intellicode. So if you go to Tools, Options, and let's look for Intellicode down here. And one of the options we'll have in here is Editor Config Inference. And I've turned that on. And what it's going to do is if I right-click and say Add New Editor Config File, it's going to scan my code. And based upon what my code has done, it's going to create an editor config. This is the config file it created that inferred from my solution, or my project. Okay, so it was done on this date, it was done against this code base, and you can modify it now, but this is what my code does right now. So if I have done things in my code, I can create a style guide out of that, an editor config guide that allows me to say, here's how we're going to do things going forward to match the current code base. So if you have an old project or a project from somebody else that you need to continue to work on and continue to maintain, you don't want to change styles halfway through. So you can use this Intellicode version of editor config to create an editor config for you that applies the same styles that the project has been using. And that way, going forward, it'll override your Visual Studio settings to apply settings that apply to this particular project. It may not be the way that you're most comfortable with, but if a project has done things a certain way, changing styles midway through is not a great idea. Don't just force a new style because you like this style better. You kind of have to conform so it's not confusing and so it's consistent. All right, now let's move on to the next tip, and it's a smaller one, but it's actually a really important one because it helps you get into Visual Studio faster. Let's go to Tools and Options. Under Projects and Solutions, the very root of it, or in general, either one, there's a few options here, a couple options that are pretty important. Now, I have already set one of them, and that is track active item in Solution Explorer. By default, I don't believe that's checked. But make sure it's checked. What that's going to do is when I am, let's just say notice I have two editor configs here. Which editor config am I in? Well, notice that this one over here is highlighted. If I click editor config over here, it highlights the one down here. That tells me exactly where I am. Let's collapse down the API. Let's collapse down the folder. Let's collapse down to DPF. I'm going to click the other editor config. It's going to open up and dial right down to that editor config and show me where I'm at. So that's a really important one to make sure, especially with two files of the same name, that can be really confusing as to where you're at. You can just look over and see where you're at. If you don't have that on, let's just uncheck that. So now if I close this, I minimize this, let's minimize this. Which editor config am I in? Well, if you hover over it, it tells you a path, which you can't keep open unless you don't move the mouse. Okay, well that's TIMCO Retail Manager editor config. That's TIMCO Retail Manager TRM API.editor config. Okay, so that's the API one, which is probably in here. So, oh, there it is. Kind of confusing, right? So just by checking that box, you make a big difference. The other one is one that's a convenience thing. And this is on by default, but you can turn it off. And this can be helpful for loading your Visual Studio quickly. Restore Solution Explorer project hierarchy state on solution load. What does that mean? Well, notice how I've got my folders and structure open, where I have controllers open, I have all the rest closed, I have highlighted editor config. This layout, Visual Studio remembers. If I were to close out Visual Studio right now and restart it, this is the layout I would have with controllers open, TRM API open and expanded, and API expanded. If I uncheck this box, it will not remember this layout, which may seem like an inconvenience. It can be if you want to go back to the same exact spot. But by doing that, you don't have to have Visual Studio remember where that is and load that back into memory. It's faster. Also, reopen documents on solution load. Right now I have 4 or 5, probably 8 or 9 documents open. Oh, 7 documents open. Maybe more, they're hidden under here. That happens a lot. And often I go through and right click and say close all but this. Well, when I'm done, I just want to get out of the project. And so I close it. When I open it back up, it's going to try to remember what all these documents are and then load each document. I don't want that. And by unchecking that box, it will allow Visual Studio to open even faster. So these two checkboxes down here make Visual Studio open faster. And this checkbox up here makes sure that you know which file you're working on by showing it to you over on the right. Both of those I think are good where I have selected them, and that is not the default. So make sure you change those unless you really want to have that convenience and don't want to worry too much about the speed of your Visual Studio loading. Okay, let's go back to our code. Let's go back to Inventory Controller and notice that we have some information for us. It says these are just messages, but it says use var instead of explicit type. Okay, so let's look at a way to clean this up automatically. There's a little broom icon. It's really tiny, but it's down here where it says run code cleanup. And there's a little drop down next to it. Select the drop down where you can configure code cleanup. And you have two different profiles here, profile 1 and profile 2. This allows you to set things up differently based upon different environments. So I'm going to set up my environment now. Remove unnecessary usings. Some people love to do this. I don't really care, but at the same time, hey, why not, right? Well, that's usually a right-click step. So you come up here and you right-click and you say remove and sort usings. But if we're in this configure code cleanup, that's one of the included fixers. Also, sort usings. So it's going to sort our usings for us instead of just kind of jumbling them up together. All right. Apply implicit/explicit type preferences. That's the var versus int or string. Let's apply that. And we can have other things as well. Add, remove braces for single line control statements. I really like to have those braces, so let's add that. And add access modifiers. You know what? I often forget that. Let's add that. And unnecessary casts is an interesting one. Really could apply all of these, but remove unused variables. That's a dangerous one in case you're halfway through modifying something and get rid of those variables. Maybe not ideal. And apply object collection initialization preferences. Let's not do that one, but let's do these. So we're going to sort the using, remove the unnecessary usings. We're going to add or remove curly braces for single line, which is going to add for us. We're going to apply our type preference, which means it's going to make it var instead of our character. And we're going to add accessibility modifiers, which means that this says, I'm going to hit OK here. This is private right now. I often forget that and just say read only, which it is private still because that's the default, but I want to make explicit about that. Also, let's create in here, let's create an if statement. If true equals true, console write line true. Makes no sense, but there's our if statement that we want to have changed. Now, if I apply the default, which is the first profile, notice the first profile here, and that's marked as default. If I apply that by clicking the broom, notice now this is private, this has curly braces, and this is var. So it's applied to this entire file. So that's a quick way to apply some of your most common standards or formatting against a file. Oh, let's look at our using statements. There's our using statements where we've ordered them by Microsoft first and in order by alphabetical. And then we've ordered them by ours, also alphabetical. So now that we have that applied to one file, the next tip is how would you apply this to, say, a project or a solution? Well, that's actually pretty easy. Right-click on your project, and you're going to say, Analyze and Code Cleanup. Let's run Profile 1. Click that, and now notice I have a whole bunch of files that have been changed. Notice the red check marks? All right, so in here has been changed. I'm not even sure where. We can actually do a comparison. So let's do a compare the unmodified. Oh, it removed a whole bunch of using statements. So that's, I think, all it did for this file. Yep. Let's look at what it did for program. I bet that did something similar. Yep, it took some using statements out. Okay. And you can go through and find all the things that this did. Let's look at this other one. Okay, we took out a using statement, we ordered it, and we changed a thing to var. So it's gone through my entire project and made changes based upon my preferences. So that's really helpful because when you're getting ready to check this code in, you can just say, you know what, go ahead and do a cleanup in case I missed anything. It's going to take care of it for you. Now it should be that EditorConfig will make sure that you don't do anything going forward, or at least it'll warn you. So I did that if statement where I said if true equals true, and then did my console write line. It's already yelling at me. I can do the quick fix, but this way I don't even have to bother with that. I just say, you know what, apply that code fix, and boom, there we go, done. All right, the next tip I want to show you is one that I've shown you before, but you may have missed it. And I'll make sure that I get it in here as well, just to, again, show you one more time. And that is the paste specials. Okay, so I've copied some JSON to the clipboard. There's some JSON. All right. Now, C# doesn't work directly with JSON. Doesn't like it. We use objects and strongly typed items and names and all the rest. Well, you can go to Edit, Paste Special, and I can choose Paste JSON as classes. I click that, and it's going to create for me a whole bunch of classes for my my items that I have selected on the clipboard. And of course, my editor is going to crash once again because I've been messing with all the settings so much. Let's try it again. Edit. Let's go to Paste Special. Paste is XML classes. Excellent. It just crashed again on me. I'm going to show you the results of it because it's something quirky in my system right now. I've got probably got to redo some Visual Studio things. But there we go. We've got the public class root object, and it's created all of these names for us. Now, these names are not correct. Okay? Fix name violation. And it'll fix it for us. Okay? So we could go through and make these changes. We could even do a cleanup on this, which cleanup doesn't do naming, I don't believe. But we might have the ability to apply our naming here, which I don't think we do. So you might have to do it manually. But what this has done for me is it's done a lot of the typing. So now all I need to do is I need to come in here and just make a few tweaks, and I've got a class object. Okay. The next one I want to show you, let's go to WPF, we'll go to the UI, and there's helpers and password box helper. All right. I've got an interesting one here. There's a couple of different suggestions I've got going on for var box equals D as password box if box is not equal to null. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the quick actions and refactoring, which I do all the time, but I want to again point it out and show you something new it can do that just makes it even better. All right. So we have this if box equals null and all the rest. But if I do Control dot here, that's going to allow it to do an explicit type if I wanted to. All right. But there's also other quick actions refactoring I can do on the if statement. Notice invert if. Check that out. So right now it says if box is not equal to null, then do this. All right. Whereas, and here's another one. Here's an even better one. So if box equals null, return, otherwise do this. Well, that doesn't necessarily make sense because if you said not equal to null, do this, either way return. Either way, you don't have to say return. It's just done. So I can quick action refactoring, I can invert this, and notice it's going to keep the sentiment. It's going to keep the logic correct even though it inverts it. Watch what happens. Invert if. It took the return statement away and it put my code inside here and say if not null, then do this. That's the same exact logic. It's just that it flipped the if and it actually made my code a little more intuitive. All right. Now up here, I've got the ability to use explicit type. Cool. That's fine. But use pattern matching. So what's seen is that var box equals D as password box, and then if box is not equal to null. What's saying is, wait, you don't need to do all that. You can collapse that down and use pattern matching to find this information out. Let's right click, quick actions, and say use pattern matching. Now let's collapse this down to if D is a password box. Well, guess what? Null is not a password box. Therefore, it's not a problem. It's going to the same exact logic, but let's back this back out. I had 1, 2, if you count the curly braces, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code that collapsed down into 4 lines of code, and the logic stayed the same. And I did all that with my right-click quick actions and refactoring. So continually check that out. If you have a for each loop, you can change that to link by using your quick action refactoring. If you have a link, you can change that possibly to a for each loop, if it's possible. But if it's possible, it will suggest how to do that. You can swap between the two. So maybe you're not really good at link, but you know that this for each loop is probably better off as a link statement. No problem. Right click, quick action refactoring, and see how to do that by just letting it do it. And that's really intelligent about how it does it. Now for this next item, I'm going to have to do a little bit of setup work. So let's just pick the program, that's fine. And I'm going to put in here a new method. I'm going to say public static. I'm going to return a tuple. I'm going to return string first name, string last name. If you don't remember, a tuple allows you to return two values, kind of like a anonymous class. You can name them or you don't have to. I prefer to name them. And I'm going to say get names, like so. And I'm going to say, let's just say return TimCorey. Okay, I'm going to return that full object like that, or the full tuple. Okay, that's all this method's going to do. Again, this is not about the method itself. It's about the fact that I'm returning a tuple. But let's just say here in main, I want to do a console write line where I write out hello Tim, the first name. So I'm going to say, let's use var. Actually, let's declare it. So we're going to say string first name, let's just say FN for first name, string LN for last name, equals get names, like so. That's one way to name a tuple, right? Or we can say, you know what, let's not worry about typing. We can do it like so. We can say var first name, last name. We're going to name these two, and we're going to get the names, okay? But I just want to do console write line. Let's do our string interpolation and say hello first name. Okay, that's it. That's all I want to do. I don't care about the last name. So instead of creating a variable for it, I can use an underscore. This is called a discard character. What it means is I don't care about this. So don't create a variable for it. A discard character, or the underscore, is a write-only variable. And yes, you heard it correctly. It's a write-only. Means information goes in, nothing comes out. You can write anything you want to a discard character. So I am going to write the last name value because I don't want to track that. I don't want to store that in memory. I just want to know about the first name. So now I can use a first name still out of the tuple, but I don't have to grab that last name value in order to do that. And that's a quick way to be a little bit more efficient in your code and just get the information you want back from the values. Okay, so that's a discard character. Now for this next one, I'm going to have to undo all of these changes. I've made a ton of changes. In fact, if you go to changes here, you'll see a ton of things, and you may be horrified because we're changing everything about TimCorey Retail Manager, and everything's horrible, right? Well, not really. Let's actually hit Save All. Cool, right? Well, I'm going to come to the root here of changes, right-click, and say Undo Changes. And it's going to say, are you sure you want to do that? Yes, I am. And by doing that, I still have two editor configs. That's because these are added items, so I can't undo them because they were non-existent. But I can click on both of these and delete them. So yes, the editor configs are gone. Now we've actually reverted back to what we started with at the beginning of this video. So you'll see that in here we're using the actual types instead of var, and there may be an if statement in here that doesn't have curly braces. Probably isn't, but there may be. And so that's back to where we started from essentially. Okay, so now we're back to where we started from. Let's go ahead and launch this because I want to show you the next cool thing, which is XAML Hot Reload. Okay, so we're going to start our application, and our application starts two things. It starts a a WinForm project and it starts an API. So we got the WinForm project open. Because I usually turn this off, but I've got it on for now because I haven't turned it off yet, pretty much. These are some tools to help you with XAML, but I really hate the fact that it's right there. You can shrink it down to that, and that's a little more helpful. I appreciate that. I really do, because it gets it mostly out of the way. I'm not a big fan of seeing something big like this in my form, but it does allow you to do some modifications to your DPF. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. I'm going to shrink down my Visual Studio as well, so you can see both. Okay? And with this now, I'm going to show you Hot Reload. Let's unpin these, and let's go to Solution Explorer and look at, remember I'm using MVVM. So my view model and my model, my view model and my view are separate. This is a login view. So this is just the front end. It has nothing to do with the code. Now let's unpin this so we have a little more space. This is my XAML, okay? And this XAML controls how my form looks and acts. So for example, if I come down here, I have username right down here. Well, what if my company came to me and said, you know what? We want that to be user space name. Well, I could see how that looks by saying, and watch over here on the right while I do this, user space name. And it changes automatically. That's XAML Hot Reload. Because I could hit save now, and that's saved my source code, and I can see immediately what it looks like. You know, if I say, you know what, I don't like it saying login form, let's have it say Timco login form. That looks better, or it doesn't. We can change how big this button is. You know, that button doesn't have the right padding. Maybe we should say 10 instead of 5. Oh, you know what? Let's just go full on 20 all around. Okay, maybe not. Maybe we'll say 40, 20. You know, we start playing around and say, you know what? I kind of like a big button like that. That's a little more bold. I like it. And you know what? Let's check the coloring out, because I'm not a great designer, but maybe we need to have some kind of gray, battleship gray or dark slate gray. Dark slate gray, that's kind of horrible, but sure. Okay? And now you start seeing all the different changes we can do to our form based upon XAML Hot Reload. This allows you to see your changes in real time, and it allows you to kind of work in your full XAML view, even though you also see your form view. You can put this on a different screen if you want. And you can change how your layouts work. You know, so you can say 2-star and see how it moves things around. You can change it to auto and see how that changes things. Okay, so you can play around in here until you get your tweaking, your formatting correct, and say, okay, I like that. And then all you do is hit save, and you're done. When you start the application up again, it's going to look like this. Now, maybe you shouldn't make it look like this specifically, but you get the picture. Now, let me give you a freebie while we're here. And I've mentioned this on a video or two, but this was, I think it was like number 2 on my all-time list of things I wanted to have. Okay, and that is this little button right here, Pop-out XAML. Okay, so we have our XAML and we have our view, and I never liked the fact that I had to have both, or I had to have one. Okay, so if I collapsed one, that was it. I couldn't see the other. Now I can pop it out, and I can have this code on a different monitor, this XAML, and I can still see my view. So now I can make my view as big as I want. All right, so this is really great, because now I can zoom in here and really get this to look, that's 100% right there. Now it's exactly the size it's going to be on someone's window, and now I can look at the XAML in a different window and make modifications if I want to. Now that Hot Reload also makes it so I don't have to do that, because I can do it when it's working live. But this is a nice option. Now the next thing I want to show you actually has to do with debugging. So let's look at the sales view model. And in the sales view model, we have this load products. And inside here, we get all the products and then we do something with them. Let's put a breakpoint right after we get the product list. Let's start this up and log in, go right to the products list. Okay, so we're starting up. There's our horrific view, but it works. And we hit log in, wait for it, and we go right here. So now I have the product list. And I can open up the locals window. I can pin this. And we see that we have a product list which says 4. I click this, and I've already done it because I was messing around beforehand. This is what you typically see. TRM desktop UI.library.models.product model. A list of 4 of them. Not helpful at all. And what we used to have to do is open this up and look and say, okay, that's the skillet. Okay, that's the fluffy bath towel, and so on. But now I can pick the property or properties that I want to see, and I can pin them. And now I see product name equals 10-inch skillet, fluffy bath towels, home repair kit, and large toaster oven, without having to open up or expand this object. Now if I hover over the product list and I expand this out, it shows it in this list as well. And you can also select multiple items. So there's retail price as well. And then you can see product name and retail price in this list. It makes it really easy for debugging quickly by just scanning through a huge list based upon the pinned properties. Now the neat thing is, and this is kind of a bonus, you can do a search in here and find the items you want. Okay, and it goes right to, okay, there's 2 different properties that have fluffy in their name. And so you can go right to the object. You can even move between them. There's only 2 of them. All right, and even if it's buried. So let's do it again. Fluffy, hit enter, goes right to it. You can go to the next one and the next one. There's 3 entries. One is the actual name itself since we pinned that value. So that search is really helpful if you're looking for something specific, especially if you got a list back that's say 100 or 300 or 500 items long. You can search in there for the one you want and then expand out and see the other values of that particular object. Okay, we can close this down, stop it. And have you ever had the issue where, you know what, I want to copy something. Let's copy this right here. I'm going to paste it down below, and you say, okay, I open this up, and that's probably a great example. Oh, I want to copy this. And so you copy this and go, oh, shoot, I had that in the clipboard. There's a clipboard ring built into Visual Studio. So if I hit Ctrl+Shift+V, I can paste whichever one I want. I can even use the hotkey of the number of the item. So I can hit, let's go down to a new line here. I can hit Ctrl+Shift+V and hit 2, and it's going to paste that in. Enter, Ctrl+Shift+V, and hit 2 again because it switched the values now for the notify a property change, and there we go. So this allows me to have multiple items on the clipboard at any one time. Now, another bonus tip for you is that there's also one built into Windows itself. If you haven't tried this already, it's pretty cool. If you hit Windows V, the first time it's going to ask you to set it up, but after that, it's going to keep track of your clipboard for you, and you can paste things in from a ways back and just click on them and paste them in. Okay, so pretty impressive stuff there right from Windows. So you have the clipboard ring inside Visual Studio, which is specific, I believe, to Visual Studio alone, but then there's a clipboard ring for Windows, which is for across all Windows products. Now, before we talked about the idea of creating your own snippets. And a snippet is like console write line. So CW, you tab twice and it fills in console.writeLine. And we even create our own with console read line to fill that in for us. But maybe you have code that it's not quite snippet worthy, but it's code that you want to remember either inside a project or cross projects. Well, there's the toolbox for that. Let's pin the toolbox. Now notice there's nothing in the toolbox. But if I say, you know what, this line right here, notify a property change, I use that a lot, and I always forget the syntax of the curly brace or the parens and all the rest. Drag it onto the toolbox, and then you can right click and say rename, and let's just call this NOPC, notify a property change. Okay, and so now if you're in here, you can click and drag that in, and there's your code. Now, obviously, one line might not be a big deal, but what if you had a whole property that you used a lot? Okay, let's rename this to demo property. And you're in here, and of course, it would keep the same name, so it might not be ideal. Because if we drag this on here, it's going to paste it in, but maybe you'd want to change the names. So snippets are sometimes better because it allows you to change the names, but this way you can kind of drag code in. For example, I use Dapper code a lot. All right, so if I come over here to my data access library, data access, and actually internal data access, this code right here, load data, Dapper load data. Now in any project I'm in, I can come over here and I can just drag in that method, and there we go. There's the structure for it. Now again, I have to change some values if things are a little different or named a little different or whatever, but that gives me that structure immediately. It's also sometimes used for demos. I try not to use it for demos because of the fact that you kind of missed how I created all that code, but it is good for blocks of code that you somewhat repeat, but you don't want to create a snippet for. You just want to have something really quick that maybe you're even doing just inside of a certain project, and then you're going to be done with it, okay? And that might be a way to drag it on. When you're done with it, right click and say delete. And it's going to say, are you sure? Yep. Delete that one as well. And now you have just that one snippet there. But that way you can kind of have that intermediate step between the clipboard or the clipboard ring and a whole snippet. There's that kind of middle ground here where you can drag sections of code or bits of code into your classes. All right, let's go ahead and clear out all of these changes because, again, I don't want to have any changes. And I'm even going to get rid of that. I'm going to show you one last one that I have found to be really helpful. Sometimes when you're working, you don't want to get distracted by, let's say, right-click, add, new class, that kind of process. You're using your mouse instead of your keyboard. You're kind of heads down right here, and you say, you know what? I need to actually, let's put our context here. So I need a new controller. And so what you're going to do is you're going to say, create a new class and add the controller to it. Well, that's going to take a few steps, where instead I could hit Ctrl+Q. Now, how do you remember Ctrl+Q? Right up here, search, it says Ctrl+Q. So I hit Ctrl+Q. I'm going to say, let's add a class. I hit enter, and I type my name, test controller. And there we go. Public class test controller. So it's created my new class in the location where my cursor already was. So it's in home controller, so therefore it created the same controller folder. And I didn't have to use my mouse for anything. It was just there, it's done. So that's a quick way to create a new file. But that's not all Ctrl+Q does. Let's just say that you wanted to tweak how the Intellicode worked. Well, Ctrl+Q, Intellicode. Okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to do the model management? Do you want to do the options? Well, let's do the options. My cursor down, I hit enter. There's Intellicode settings. Notice how quick that was? Ctrl+Q asks for it, it searches it, and it finds it. Okay, this finds practically everything. So whatever you want to do, it will find. Theme. Notice the suggestions. Try theme. Okay, change environment color themes. Oh, there we go, dark. So I can change that right here. And so it takes me right where I need to go based upon what I ask for. So Ctrl+Q searches for practically anything and it will find it for you and take you right there, whether it's in the editor or whether it's in your code. Okay, so Ctrl+Q, really helpful. Now I know I told you 15 tips and I've already given you a bonus 1 or 2 in here, but I want one more bonus one. I always try to give you more than this. I thought 15 was probably enough and there's just more to show. If you come down here to preview features, vertical document tab layout. Some people really wanted this and I can see why. So I'm going to show it to you. So right now I have a lot of space left to right, but not as much top to bottom. So I can right click on my tabs and say set tab layout to be left instead of top. There we go. Now it's moved up a little bit and my tabs are now on the left. I can even resize this if I wanted to, shrink it down or expand it. I can switch between my items. This means I have more room to see tabs and I have more vertical room on my monitor. Usually monitors have less vertical room than they do horizontal room. And so this allows you to make better use of your overall space on your monitor if you want to do that kind of thing. You don't like it? No problem. Right click and say set layout back to top. But again, notice if I open up a lot of files, there is this whole list of files now that are open that I don't see. But if I right click, set tab layout to left, now I'll be able to see all the open documents, even though they wouldn't all show before because there was just too many to open. Okay, so I can just keep adding documents and it just keeps scrolling. Okay, so that's a new feature of Visual Studio that's actually in a preview mode. So you go to Tools, Options, under Preview Features. You can check that box to enable that vertical tab or vertical document tab layout. Now there are a couple more features in this preview that might be of use to you. One is load projects faster by having IntelliSense initialized in the background. That means IntelliSense will not be available immediately when you open your application. Probably doesn't matter. By doing that, your project will load faster. Also, auto hide tool windows on startup. So for example, a Toolbox or the data sources or SQL Server, Object Explorer, we can close all of those or auto hide them except for Solution Explorer. That makes the loading of Visual Studio faster as well because it's not also populating those windows. Okay, so again, a little bit more speed on startup using a couple of those preview features. All right, so that is probably like 18, 19, 20 tips. I shot for 15, but we got a little higher than that. That's a bunch of tips on how to make your editor even faster in Visual Studio. So there's a lot of power here. There's a lot of things you can do to really fly through this. I already covered before, so I didn't cover this time. We have snippets as well. So I show you in a previous video how to create your own snippets and how to create your own item templates. And soon we'll have a video on how to create your own project templates. Okay, so there's a lot of things you can do to tweak your system the way you want it and really fly through the setup stuff, the basic stuff, the stuff that makes it similar to everything else. Okay, so code cleanup really helps you make sure that your code is consistent across all your projects. And Intellicode allows you to move faster as you're typing. And the EditorConfig allows you to keep those consistencies across your team with your application. So all of these tools built into Visual Studio don't cost a dime and can really make your life faster, more efficient, and more consistent. I would encourage you, try them out. Let me know what your favorites are down in the comments, but also let me know, is there something else that you find really, really helpful to making your editor faster and more performant? Okay? Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.